Hi, I'm Jean Schumacher. I'm founder of Simply Plant-Based, where I have several programs to help you to change your health destiny through a plant-based lifestyle. And coming soon, we've got the Pregnancy Advantage, where we're going to help women to get their bodies pregnant ready. And with me tonight, I've got Dr. Neal Barnard, who has written another amazing book. And if you don't know who he is the founder of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. He's got our back, that's for sure. And he's also the founder of the Barnard Medical Center. So thank you so much, Dr. Barnard, for being here yet again.
Thank you, Jean. Great to be back with you.
And tonight, this is part 4 of your amazing book called Your Body in Balance. And this section, we did the first 2 chapters, we were on the women. And then the second one we did for the men. And now tonight, it's conquering diabetes. So let's start with the basics.
You bet.
What is diabetes?
Well, diabetes, simply put, means there's too much sugar in your blood. The sugar is glucose. And glucose is actually a good thing. It provides energy for your muscles, for your brain, for all the rest of you. But the problem in diabetes is that glucose sugar isn't going to where it's supposed to go. It's not getting into your muscles. It's not getting into your brain. And instead, it's getting stuck in the blood, circulating around. So the doctor measures your blood, and you have a high blood sugar. What you want to have is have that sugar going into the muscles where it can be burned. So diabetes means too much sugar in the blood.
So is your insulin not working right?
That's right. Insulin is a hormone, of course, that is made in the pancreas, and it goes to the muscle cells and the liver cells, and it acts just like a key to let the glucose get out of the blood into the cell. And if you have diabetes, there's something wrong with insulin. Either you don't have any insulin, your body's not making it, or it's just not working the way it should be.
Well, you told a guy's story. This was the real estate broker on Long Island.
Right.
Can you share that story? Because I thought it was a really good one.
Yeah, Guy is a very successful real estate broker. He lives in Long Island with his wife, Deborah. Things were going generally well for him, except he'd been gaining some weight over time. In fact, had gained quite a lot of weight, and his vision started to go. So he sees the doctor, and the doctor puts two and two together, and eventually discovered, here's your problem. It's not like you need glasses. You have diabetes, and diabetes affects the eyes in many ways. Just elevated blood sugar can cause temporary changes in vision. So he suddenly had this new diagnosis that he did not want to have, but it got worse. His heart turned out to be not very healthy. He had what we call a silent heart attack, a heart attack that he was not aware of earlier on, but they could detect it from the examination. And so he had gone from a guy who thought he was mostly healthy to a guy whose visual problems were the least of his difficulties. He had type 2 diabetes, which was in poor control, and he had heart disease as well. So his doctor recommended various treatments. Take metformin pills for your diabetes. We can do some stents for your heart. We can do all these things. But he and his wife, Deborah, started thinking about this, deciding there had to be some better way. So she went on the internet. She started looking, and before too long, she found our work that said diabetes could be a two-way street. You've got it. Maybe we can get rid of it. And she then learned about Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn's work at the Cleveland Clinic, who's done brilliant work on preventing and reversing heart disease. So they jumped in, and they threw out the meat and the dairy products and the eggs, and they went to a plant-based diet, and Guy started losing weight and improving and improving. First of all, his vision cleared up, but his blood sugar came down. He was at about, I think, 295 to start with, and he dropped down to 190. So he dropped more than 100 pounds. Dropped more than 100 pounds.
That's a person.
Yeah. And his blood cholesterol on no cholesterol-lowering drugs, his total cholesterol was something like 128. We wanted below 200. He was just way below that. And his bad cholesterol was terrific too. It was below 70. So anyway, he was just a picture of health. He no longer had diabetes. So back in the old days, we would think that's not possible. It is possible. And he felt better than he felt in a long time. One other thing I need to tell you though, he had a friend, colleague, whose wife was sick, really sick, and she needed nursing care with the kinds of problems that we talk about, the metabolic issues. So he passes along his prescription to her. Let's change our diet. and it revolutionized her health as well. She ended up improving so much that she could leave the nursing home and go back home. And Deborah, Guy's wife, in the process,
That's awesome.
She was pretty healthy to start with, but she lost 25 pounds too. So they become tremendous advocates. And I met them. I was giving a talk in New York, and I happened to just run into her in the hall, and she picked me out, and we started talking, and so I thought, what a wonderful success. So anyway, that's Guy and Deborah.
Wow, that's a great story. I mean, when you can see the power of it, and then you can start sharing it and paying it forward. I mean, there's just nothing better.
Well, I think you said it. I think that's exactly it. First of all, it's important to recognize the power of this. Now, not everyone is as sick as Guy was, or they may not have as much weight to lose as he did, but they can succeed even more rapidly. And so anyway, he did wonderfully, but he did the most beautiful thing of all, which, if somebody just gives you a prescription, you take the drug, it doesn't help anybody else. But if they show you how to eat in such a way that we're tackling the cause of these problems, and then you can share that with your spouse, your kids, your extended family, your community, other people that you're working with, you're revolutionizing the health of the people that you know.
I know. It's so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's 3 types of diabetes. Would you explain what the difference is?
Yep, you bet. Type 1 is childhood onset, used to be called childhood onset. The pancreas has stopped making insulin. The pancreas has what we call beta cells that make insulin. They're dead. And the reason they're dead is that an autoimmune reaction has killed them off. The body is attacking its own insulin-producing cells. Now, the more common type is type 2. And there the pancreas is still making insulin, but for some reason the cells are resisting it. And we now know why that is. It's because the cells are filled with microscopic fat particles that interfere. And the third type is gestational diabetes, and as its name implies, it occurs during pregnancy, but it's effectively the same thing as type 2, except, in other words, the cells are insulin resistant, but it goes away after pregnancy is over. But it's a sign that you're headed for type 2 diabetes if you've got gestational, and it comes back with each pregnancy, and eventually it just turns into type 2 for a great many women. So it's a shot across the bow. So that's where we are. What Guy had was type 2. It's the most common type.
Well, just going back to type 1, is it possible to reverse that?
With what we know now, no, except perhaps in very early cases. There are some people working on cases where it's just transitioning. The last few beta cells are being killed off, and there's been some suggestion that type 1 could be reversed. However, if it is irreversible, which in most cases I think it is, because the pancreas is just, the cells are gone, you could still improve it a lot. And well, 2 things should be said. The first is that what kills a person with type 1 is the same thing that kills a person with type 2. And it's not a high blood sugar for most people. It's cardiovascular disease. The heart and the blood vessels are attacked by this disease. So if we follow a healthy, completely plant-based diet and really baby the heart and baby the arteries, you can live a normal life. But the other piece of this is that when people have gone on low-fat vegan diets, which we have been pioneering for type 2 diabetes, but if they got type 1, what we discover is they do better too. Their insulin requirement drops 30, 40% in many cases, and their complications are much less likely to occur, as we've seen. So it's the same diet approach, but with type 1, they're likely to not be able to get rid of it completely.
Why? Why is this happening?
Why does type 1 happen?
Yeah.
Well, there are some genetic predispositions to it, but that's not the whole story, because you can have identical twins, one gets it, the other doesn't. So it's not just genetics. Some evidence has suggested that it might be a virus that might tip it off, but there has been a really interesting area of research, and that's looking at cow's milk. And it was 1992, the New England Journal of Medicine. Researchers had looked at a large number of newly diagnosed kids with type 1 diabetes. Every single one had antibodies to a fraction of cow's milk. And those antibodies in turn appeared to be able to destroy the insulin-producing cells. So ever since then, I have to say, researchers have been trying to understand does cow's milk act as a trigger for type 1 diabetes? And could avoiding cow's milk lifelong prevent it? And here it's a medical controversy. We really don't have the answer. But there does seem to be a clear-cut advantage to breastfeeding. And I would argue that this is one of many reasons why children should not be having cow's milk at all. They should get milk from mom, from your mother's breast. And after the age of weaning, there's no requirement for any kind of milk at all. And that's the safest, we believe.
Awesome. Well, how should you keep track and check your blood sugar to keep it in control?
You walk you through the numbers. Different doctors prescribe different regimens for their patients about how often to test, but the numbers are like this. If you take your fasting glucose, that means you got up in the morning, you haven't had anything to eat for many hours. If it's below 100, you are in the normal range. But if it's above 100, that's when the doctor is talking pre-diabetes. You're headed for type 2 diabetes. But once it's above 125, the doctor says, this is diabetes. Now, doctors will, if they get it once, they're going to want to confirm it before arriving at that diagnosis, but that's where they are. Now, more and more people are using hemoglobin A1C. What it is, hemoglobin is the pigment inside a red blood cell. And researchers discovered that you can actually add up how much sugar has gotten into the red blood cell and adhered to the hemoglobin. And that's a sign of your having had a high blood sugar in the 3 months or so prior to the test. So A1C values, if they're below 5.7, we're happy. If it's above 5.7, the doctor is going to talk about prediabetes. And once it hits 6.5, that's diabetes, type 2.
Okay. Well, for someone who is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, like say, let's go back to the turn of the century, 2000. What would they have been told or advised back in the day?
Unfortunately, they're told kind of the same thing that a lot of them are told today, which is you got
Really?
well, they shouldn't be because research has changed this, but they're often told you need to lose weight, and the way to lose weight is to cut calories. So you're eating 2,000 calories a day. Let's cut you down to 1,500 calories a day. And I got to tell you, Gene, that gets old by Wednesday.
Oh my God, yes.
These.
I'm ready to eat the phone book. What are you talking about?
That's exactly it.
Little salt, little sauce. I mean, it tastes good.
They will also be counseled to keep carbohydrates steady. By that, I mean not too much, not too little. And the reason, what they're really doing is they're planning their diet around their insulin doses. And the idea is, if I'm going to make it up, you're on 20 units of insulin or something like that. If one day you have a whole lot of carbohydrate and then the next day you don't have any, we can't really regulate how much insulin you're going to need. So the dietitians and nurses and others have encouraged people to keep their carbohydrate intake pretty much steady from day to day and throughout the day. So that's kind of where we were until about 2003, when the NIH, National Institutes of Health, gave us a grant to test that diet against a much better diet, or what we hoped would be a much better diet, and that's a low-fat, completely vegan diet or a plant-based diet.
Well, let's talk about the Seventh-day Adventist study. What did that show in regards to diabetes?
Okay. The Seventh-day Adventists are pretty much health-conscious people. And so that has meant that every researcher in the world wants to put them under the microscope. So you've got this huge number of people that are non-smokers and mostly teetotalers, and they eat very moderately, and as I said, are health-conscious, and so forth. However, some Adventists eat meat. Some have meat, but maybe only fish, not other kinds of meat. Some are vegetarian, but they're eating cheese and eggs. And some follow a completely plant-based diet, a completely vegan diet. And what researchers have found is that those diets have a dramatic association with health. The first thing that researchers discovered, and this is called the Adventist Health Study 2, is that the meat eaters are heavier. By and large, the average meat eater their weight is in the overweight range. But the average vegan was much slimmer. And the other diet groups were right in between. The fish eaters were sort of halfway between the meat eaters and the vegans. But then what really got everybody's attention was diabetes. For the meat eaters, it was common. For the fish eaters, it was a little bit lower because they weren't having pork and beef and so forth, but they were having fish. It was a little bit lower. But when you got to the vegan Adventists, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in the vegan Adventists was 2.9%, about a third that of the meat eaters. Yes, a very rare condition. And so now some of these are people who became vegan to try to tackle their type 2 diabetes, and other cases, they were people who had been either raised that way or had adopted it early on. But what we were noticing was that people with a plant-based diet were the ones who tended to have the healthiest weight and the least risk of type 2 diabetes. And in fact, that's part of what encouraged us to put it to the test in a randomized trial.
Well, your team decided to test a low-fat vegan diet in people with diabetes, who've had it for more than 8 years. Half the group started a conventional diet, basically cutting calories, limiting carbohydrates. The other half eliminated, animal products, fatty foods, kept it to a minimum, but had no limit on calories or carbohydrates.
That's right.
What was your results?
Okay. First of all, both groups did well. The people on the conventional diet, when we looked at their A1C, they dropped about 0.4 absolute percentage points, which is a good drop on average. However, the vegan group dropped 3 times more than that. They dropped 1.2 absolute percentage points just on average. And I got to tell you, Gene, if you had a pill that would do that, that is a great pill. Their cholesterol's improved, their blood pressure's improved. Many of them needed less medication. In some cases, they come off their medication completely. And that's where we started to see what I have to say, what at the time I was not really prepared for, which was diabetes going away, because that was thought to be impossible. But now,
were you doing the Snoopy happy dance?
it was a big moment. I have to say, this is 2 decades ago. But at the time, people would get all upset if you would say that someone's diabetes went away. So the idea was, once you have diabetes, you'll always have diabetes. And I have to say, we've gotten quite comfortable now with saying that it's a reversible condition, but not really likely to be reversed unless the person tackles the cause of it. And the cause is not eating rice or eating bread or things. We've got to be much more modern than those kinds of diets. And I have to say, it's an unfortunate thing to see that still there are many people who emerge from their diabetes clinic and they're told to limit carbohydrate, and as if that was the cause of it. It's a symptom of it. If bread makes your blood sugar spike, it's for an extended period of time, that's a sign that you're insulin resistant. That's a sign that your cells are not behaving, because healthy cells should be able to take that glucose out of the blood. If they can't, there's something wrong. So if all you're doing is avoiding bread, you're not getting to the cause of the disease.
It's the root cause, and it's the food. It's the food. Yeah. We've got to get to the cause, the root cause, and it's the food. So how does a plant-based diet improve blood glucose, and how does it control it so dramatically?
Well, at first we didn't know why. We just knew that it worked, and we knew that it mirrored the observational studies and so forth. But I want to give credit to our friends at Yale University, Jerry Schulman and Kit Peterson and their team, because using MR spectroscopy, that's magnetic resonance spectroscopy, they've been able to look into the muscle cells, and they have found fat particles that we call intro-myocellular lipid, but it's fat inside muscle cells.
Can't you guys just call it fat? I mean, come on.
No, it's only got 3 letters. Doctors don't like words like that. It's got to, it's got to have more than one syllable, Gene.
Clearly.
So the intro-myocellular lipid is not the same as just belly fat or thigh fat. You can be quite a thin person, but if you've got insulin resistance, that's a sign that the fat is building up inside your muscle cells, also in your liver cells. We'll call that hepatocellular lipid. As it's building up, it interferes with insulin's ability to work. And an analogy might be when I was a kid growing up in North Dakota,
Fargo, right?
Fargo, exactly. Some less well-behaved children who had a trick that they liked to play on their neighbors. The neighbors were gone, out of the house, and then the kids would put chewing gum in their front door lock. So you arrive home and you put your key in your lock. I hope you didn't live in a neighborhood like this, Gene.
I'd be hunting you down. I'd be hunting you down.
The key doesn't work anymore. And there's nothing wrong with the key, but the lock is all gummed up. So in your cells, you don't have gum, you've got fat The insulin key itself is fine. There's nothing wrong with the insulin. It attaches to the receptor perfectly fine, but the cell is filled not with gum, but in this case, fat. Beef fat, pork fat, fryer grease, fish fat, chicken fat, even the vegetable oils will gum up the works. And if you get those out of the diet, what we have shown is that the fat inside the cells dissipates. In other words, the cause of the insulin resistance is going away. And that means the diabetes itself is on the road to reversal.
So basically it's breakfast, lunch, dinner.
Yeah, and all the snacks that people eat. Exactly. So to be clear about it, you're having lunch and you take a piece of bread and on top of the bread you put bologna or salami or whatever it is, and a lot of mayonnaise and cheese.
Oh
and the
God.
fat, well, people do. And the fat.
That would have been me, back in the day. I mean, and a half an inch thick of mayonnaise at least. I mean, woo.
So the fat from those foods gets into your bloodstream and it goes to the muscle and liver cells, and the fat enters the cell and it stops insulin from working. So now Dr. Barnard says, let's avoid animal products and keep the oils really low. So I'm having a bean burrito or a veggie chili. I'm having my angel hair pasta topped with a light marinara sauce or arrabbiata sauce or whatever. It can be spicy, it can be tasty, but the fat is not there. And so the fat starts dissipating from the cells. Insulin can work again, the diabetes can improve, and in some cases, it's flat out gone. So that's what was happening in Guy's body. Guy learned about this approach, and he said, let me try it. He found it easy. He found it, frankly, life-changing. And he lost weight, which is obviously a very common side effect of a plant-based diet.
And I hate that men it melts, it just falls off of them. I can't stand you guys. I mean, for me, it's like my fat and I have been together forever and it doesn't want to give up the mothership. I mean.
Well, you've lost a lot of weight too. So
I have, but I still have more to go, but it doesn't want to give up the mothership. I mean, it's like holding on for dear life.
I understand. So anyhow, but he improved and so many other people have improved. And this would not have happened had he just relied on taking his prescriptions and following a standard diabetes diet. It's not so likely to work.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, what about my extra virgin olive oil that's cold pressed by virgins on the 7th solstice of the 7th month?
Yeah, I really think that people overdo it on all these fats. Keep in mind, there is no faucet on the olive tree. The only way that you get olive oil, virgin or otherwise, is by taking 10,000 olives, throwing away all the fiber and the pulp and everything except for that oil. And I think of it as really a refined product, sort of like taking sugar out of sugar cane. And I know people like to think of olive oil as kind of romantic, but I really see it as part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Well, one of the recommendations was you said to favor low glycemic index. A lot of people don't know what this means. So can you explain this to us?
Yeah, it's really pretty simple. And here I want to tip my hat to David Jenkins, who is at the University of Toronto, a real genius. He invented the glycemic index back in 1981, if I'm remembering correctly. And what you do is you bring in some volunteers and you feed them white bread. And their blood sugar does go up to a degree. And then you feed them pumpernickel bread. And their blood sugar doesn't go up so much. So the pumpernickel is a low glycemic index food. You feed them some spaghetti. And if the spaghetti is al dente, in other words, it's not overcooked, their blood sugar doesn't rise so much. That's a lower glycemic index. But now you cook it like crazy, and so it's kind of into mush. Now it's higher glycemic index. It raises your blood sugar. This is not really rocket science. It just means that certain foods digest more rapidly. They release the sugar into the blood more rapidly, and those are high glycemic index foods. So in our research studies, we avoid the animal products. That's rule number one.
Right.
We keep oils really low, so we learn how to cook without them and to have, say, a non-fat dressing and that kind of thing. That's the rule number two. Rule number three, favor the low GI foods, low glycemic index foods. What are they? Instead of sugar, you might favor fruit. Fruit is sweet.
Yeah, but doesn't fruit have sugar?
It does. However, for whatever reason, most fruits are low glycemic index. They have fiber. They have pulp that slows down the absorption of the sugars. If you're having
would that work for orange juice?
Well, keep in mind, the more it's an actual fruit, the better off it's going to be, as opposed to one where you've extracted the juice. If you're having bread, wheat bread is, I think, perfectly fine for most people. However, its glycemic index is not as low as, say, the breads made from rye, and there are some others as well. If you have a cold cereal, it's going to have a high glycemic index, especially if there's a toy inside. So have brand cereal.
I love those toys.
You know what I mean. The
Yes.
toy won't affect you, but everything that's in that package will. Or oatmeal, old-fashioned oatmeal, something like that. For whatever reason, white potatoes tend to raise blood sugar. Sweet potatoes are more gentle on your blood sugar. Beans are the glycemic index champions. They are very good. They have a very low glycemic index. Green vegetables like broccoli and collards and kale, don't even worry about them. They're all, could consider them all really low. And pasta is not off the menu, but it ought to be not overly cooked.
Okay. Well, would like a rice pasta be better than, say, a wheat?
You can try different ones. And also what you're going to discover is that your reaction to them will change over time. So if you are very insulin resistant now, almost anything you eat is going to make your blood sugar spike for a while. But as time goes on, those spikes are going to get lower and lower and lower. And for most people, it's maybe a week or something like that, where they notice that their insulin sensitivity is coming back.
A week?
Or less. And by that I mean a person changes their diet and they're finger sticking, they're checking their fasting glucose or their glucose after meals, and they discover that usually within a matter of days, sometimes it's the first day, it can be 2-3 days. A week is a little bit longer than would usually be required. Now that doesn't mean the diabetes goes away in a week. What I mean is you're going to start noticing the effects on your blood sugar in that period of time. The cells are giving up that extra fat. And this will happen also with type 1s. People with type 1, they'll find that their blood sugars are going down, even though this diet has more carbohydrate than they've been having.
Well, that's what typically I always associate. Oh my God, type 2 diabetes, can't have carbohydrates.
Right. Big mistake. That's not modern thinking. And in fact, if you look at Japan, prior to westernization of the diet, back in 1960, they were eating phenomenal amounts of rice. They didn't know that carbohydrate is supposed to make you heavy and get diabetes. They were the skinniest people on the planet. And they had very, very little diabetes, even into advanced age. And then as westernization occurred and cheese and meat came in, fatty foods came in, and rice started to give up its predominance in the diet. Rice has been dropping, unfortunately, quite a lot in Japan. Diabetes has come in a very big way. So it's the fat that gets into the cells. It's not the carbohydrate that's the issue. And Japan would do very well to throw out all the animal products and the Western dietary habits and go back to a rice-based diet. They would be much healthier.
Well, so some type 2 diabetes we can reverse. Does living plant-based lifestyle help someone with type 1?
It will.
In what way?
It will not make the diabetes go away. If a person has type 1, they're going to continue to need injections. But it does have two benefits. The first benefit is that your need for insulin is going to drop. It can drop by 30%, 40%. It's very common. And what we think is going on is that the person with type 1, despite the fact that they're now injecting insulin, they are also somewhat insulin resistant, meaning their muscles and their livers do have some fat in them that's making the insulin not work very well. So when they follow this plant-based diet, their insulin resistance improves. At least we think that's it. That's the reason. But what we know is that when people with type 1 diabetes use this kind of diet, in so many cases, they do really well. But the more important thing is that when they follow this approach, there's no cholesterol in the diet anymore. There's no animal fat. And that's going to protect their vision. That's going to protect the arteries to their heart, the arteries to the brain. It's easier on their kidneys. So it means they can live a normal life without the fear of the complications that otherwise would have been in front of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
You made a pretty provocative statement in this book, which I was just like, whoa. You said a plant-based diet may prevent type 1 diabetes. You're going to have to explain this one.
We need more study here, but there has been substantial evidence that exposure to cow's milk proteins may be the trigger for type 1 diabetes. Cow's milk is a cocktail that includes a variety of proteins. And in the course of drinking that milk, the toddler who's at daycare or whatever, drinking a glass of milk, the milk proteins get into the child's blood. In some cases, the body reacts to those proteins by making antibodies that appear to be able to attack and destroy the beta cells of the pancreas. Now, this is theoretical, but there's a lot of evidence that this is in fact the case, as well as evidence that breastfeeding is somewhat protective. However, I'm going to say that we need more evidence because in many studies, it's really hard to find people where they didn't start dosing their kids with cow's milk in one way or another. What I would really like to see is studies on kids whose parents agree they are not going to expose them to cow's milk proteins and see if you can protect them from developing type 1 diabetes.
Wow. Okay. Powerful. Wow.
Yes. Oh, I mean, can you imagine? It's not only the expense of having diabetes and the limitations and the side effects of taking insulin where you can become hypoglycemic and so forth, but just the truncating nature of this disease on your lifespan when it's not well controlled. So our goal is to help people with diabetes to live a totally normal life, and a healthy low-fat plant-based diet is key to that. But if we can prevent this disease in the first place, let's do it. I mean, there's no question that we could prevent the vast majority of cases of type 2. I suspect we can prevent many cases of type 1 as well, but we need more research to prove that.
Okay. Well, is there anything we should be concerned about for people who are diabetic? You know, like other health issues? I think you kind of talked a little bit about them, but.
Yes. Diabetes increases the risk of a wide range of conditions. I guess most people are aware that type 1 diabetes will increase the risk of heart disease, cardiovascular disease. Diabetes is a major risk factor for that. But that's just the start of the list. If you look at Alzheimer's risk, it's about double for people with diabetes. Yes. First of all, Alzheimer's is really frequent anyway. So anything that increases it even a little bit is not something you want. But with diabetes, it approximately doubles the risk. We've
got an epidemic coming too.
The epidemic is beginning already. For those of us who have had family members with this, it's the disease you just don't want to get. And you and I have talked about this in the past, but an additional way to reduce our Alzheimer's risk is to get diabetes back under control and make it go away to the extent that we can.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, what about hypoglycemia? What is that?
Yes, hypoglycemia means that your blood sugar has now come too low, hypoglycemia. And that's a side effect of medication. So I've injected some insulin, and as time goes on, if the insulin is trying to get the sugar out of my blood, but if I fail to eat any food at all, now the insulin is working when there's basically not much sugar in the blood, and you can get too low of a blood sugar. So the symptoms are that you'll feel woozy, you might feel shaky, you might start sweating, you'll feel nervous, you'll feel inexplicably hungry. And if it goes on, you can become comatose. You could, in theory, even die because your brain needs blood sugar. So I have to say, when people start a healthy, low-fat vegan diet, the diet is so powerful that it's important to start backing patients off of their medications, because the medications, especially insulin and sulfonylurea drugs, they're powerful. And if you don't start backing off on those drugs, the patient can become hypoglycemic. Now, of course, the patient is thrilled because they discover they don't need 20 units of insulin. They're now down to 12 or 8 or 6, or they're off of it. Take your time with that. It's important to work with your caregiver and let them know you're making a diet change. Let them back you off your drugs as things go along. But that's a very, very common scenario for people to reduce or even eliminate their insulin. And frankly, many people eliminate all their drugs.
Okay. Well, I know your book is coming out February 4th, and it's available on Amazon, and you can pre-order it. So if anybody's out there listening, do check that out, because I have to tell you, this is like probably one of your best books, honestly. It's so good. And you got a book tour coming up. Tell us about that.
I do. I'm going to be touring to lots and lots and lots of cities. And if you go to our website, which is pcrm.org, you'll see where I'm going to be. I'm starting on February 4th and 5th in New York City, and then on the 6th in Baltimore, and on the 7th and 8th here in Washington, D.C., and then going far beyond. And so I'm hoping people will go to website at pcrm.org to see the tour schedule. But there's one other thing that I would love it if people do. I mentioned how Guy improved his health, and I'm hoping that people will pick up Your Body in Balance and improve their own health. In fact, let me wave it around. Let me brag about it. There it is.
There it is.
But Guy talked to his friend who had a wife who needed help. And she was in a nursing home was really sick with health problems. And he shared this information with that family. And she was able to pack up her bags, check out of the nursing home, and get back to her family.
I mean, that doesn't happen.
Well,
you go into the nursing home and you come out in a pine box. I mean, let's be realistic.
And that wouldn't have happened, except that Guy shared this information. So here's what I'm suggesting, is when I write a book like Your Body in Balance, my hope is that people will read it and they'll profit from it. But the most important thing of all is to share this information with other people. If you know somebody who wants to knock off some weight, who's got diabetes, or who's concerned about this, or somebody has a family member, or somebody's about to raise a family, or if someone has the other issues that we've talked about, menstrual problems or menopausal problems or endometriosis, my real hope is that we're going to be a team together sharing this information with other people. And when I got my medical degree, I was qualified to give out metformin prescriptions and insulin prescriptions and things. That only helps the person who you give the prescription to. But when you give knowledge about how to select foods, you affect their whole family, you affect the whole community. And it can be sometimes discouraging when you realize the pharmaceutical industry is enormous, this medical complex that we have is huge, and how are we ever going to replace that with healthier eating? Well, there's an important place for medical care. But if we share this information around, the requirement for medical care will be much reduced. And that has really got to be our goal. Let's share the information, save some lives.
Please do. And I think one of the biggest things is to find a support group, to help you. And there's a lot of Facebook groups out there that can help you, that can provide the support as you transition, because you're going to have questions. Oh my gosh, you're going to have a lot of questions. So it's really helpful to find a group, a support, and get a life coach, or a health coach to help you, or pop down to the Barnard Medical Center. You guys will help down there. So
we'd be more than happy to. And by the way, along the lines of also sharing this message more broadly, not only do patients come here, we're in Washington, D.C. at the Barnard Medical Center. Not only do patients come and their families come, we have classes all the time, every week. We have classes that are free that people can attend. But we also have medical students who come, and doctors, not only from the U.S., but from other countries as well, residents in training, because they in turn can carry this message to their own clinics and their own practices. So to me, that's my theme for the day. Let's share this information. I'm hoping that people get better individually, but the best thing you can do is to share it.
How proud you must be, honestly. Well, do you still have that little glow every time you pull up to the Barnard Medical Center?
I have to say we're mission focused here. The whole idea is to help people to come into the door with the problems that they have, and with the risks and challenges that affect their families, and for us to do our best to give them information to help themselves. And by the way, as much as I've been maligning prescriptions, we will use them if we need them. So we do have regular medical care here as well. But the goal here is to try to prevent problems, tackle them if we can. And it is an interesting thing to see the transition that people go through. A person with diabetes, this may be the first time they've ever heard that the diabetes could improve through diet, and they're afraid. What, you're telling me I can eat fruit? Fruit's full of carbs, and you bring them in to meet with a dietitian, and they sit down with their reluctant spouse, and they kind of go through this new diet plan, and they try it on like a new pair of clothes, and pretty soon it starts to fit pretty well. So I have to say it is an interesting transition to see people go through this change.
There's nothing better to see someone change their health destiny and to get better, honestly.
Yes, and then they become advocates. As I mentioned, Guy and Deborah earlier on, and they have been really wonderful advocates for sharing their experience with others, as you have, Jean. So doing that kind of sharing is what it's all about.
All right. Well, thank you so much. As always, you're amazing. Truly. And our next show, we're going to be doing, this is part 5, we're going to be talking about the healthy thyroid and healthy skin and hair. Because I know a lot of people who've had issues, hair is falling out or it gets brittle or thin. So I know a lot of women are going to be, stay tuned for that. All right. Well, thank you again, Neal. And I'll see you at the JCC in Manhattan.
Thank you, Jane. Look forward to it.